At the time of me recording this, I finally caught up with the new canon in terms of books, and I've read every adult and young adult novel released since Disney rebooted the canon. It took me a bit of extra time to get Queen's Shadow, and the reason for that is even though it was listed on every site in the UK, including Amazon and Wordery, none of them actually received any stock, or at the most received some stock they weren't supposed to get. Why? That's a good question. After receiving an email from Amazon stating my pre-ordered book wasn't in stock and it would be delivered in a month, I asked this on Twitter and tagged in E.K. Johnston, Amazon UK, Wordery and Arrow Publishing, the people responsible for the UK Star Wars books. 5 days later and I still hadn't received a reply, so I pointed out how one of them should have answered by that point. Wordery got back to me and said they would look into it, then they notified me that I could buy the paperback version when it was released, but not the hardcover because it's restricted from sale in the UK. What the actual fuck? It's the first Star Wars book in the new canon not to be released in hardcover in the UK. Even the children's books got hardcover releases. At that point, the thread turned into a shit show because when E.K. Johnston and I were talking about it in a perfectly civilised manner, specifically her explaining that it's due to international licensing rights, the White Knights turned up, and I assume you still call them knights even if they're a bunch of gender fluid fucks. These days, apparently asking about a book means I'm, and I quote, harassing someone. The woman who said that was a feminist ginger bitch who didn't understand what had been talked about before, and I find that ironic because as she's an author, she should have had the ability to read up. But she didn't. She jumped into things that didn't concern her, starting with "sorry to butt in," as if that justifies it, made accusations that weren't true, and all because she's a sheeple of the PC politics we have these days, proving once and for all that gingers don't have souls. I even got accused of lying about the book. Why on earth would I lie? What would I gain from lying? Absolutely nothing. The person who accused me of lying said everyone who pre-ordered on Amazon got theirs, which is bullshit. Just because a few people got theirs doesn't mean everyone did, and it's highly likely that since the book is restricted from sale in the UK, those that did receive them just got the small amount of stock that had already been shipped to the UK. So I've been accused of sexism, harassment, and now fabricating stories. All of these accusations came from women and gender fluid people who had nothing to do with the book. But hey, I must be toxic, right? Because I asked about a book release. Naughty, naughty me. I'll leave a link in the description so you can see the thread on Twitter, and I'm telling you, it's a fucking shit show because the White Knight social justice warriors turned up. Anyway, I managed to find a copy of the book in England and it turned up, so I was pleased I'd finally be able to read it, but unfortunately my excitement had been misplaced because the book is boring as hell. It's fucking awful. The entire first section, which takes up about a fifth of the book, is almost nothing but Padme and her handmaidens lounging around. Action has been removed in favour of having a character-driven book, and while I appreciate the effort, the problem with Padme is that she doesn't actually have any personality to speak of. So when she's used as the base of a character-driven book, there's literally nothing there to make the book interesting, and that's the problem with Queen's Shadow. Let's be honest, Padme's entire personality can be summed up in one word: democracy. I believe in democracy. Democracy will save us. Everyone gets a medal. She's basically the precursor of the social justice warriors and in her own way is a Mary Sue. And no, despite Gwendolyn Christie's comments that Mary Sue is a sexist term, it isn't. The male version is Gary Stew, and since they mean the same thing based on which gender the character is, it's no more sexist than Jane Doe or John Doe. People need to get a fucking reality check. The naming of Padme's handmaidens did my fucking head in. They all fucking rhyme and end in the same sound that Padme's does. So we have Padme, Sabe, Sashay, Dorme, Corday. It goes on, and I could barely keep up with which one was which because none of them had a fucking personality except for Sabe. How about a bit of fucking variety in the names, huh? There's a bit at the beginning that confused me because Johnson seemed to be writing about Padme's funeral scene from Revenge of the Sith. Then I realised that it was just a mirror of that scene. She's floating with her hair laid out, arms folded over her stomach and white flowers in her hair, and that's exactly the same as in the movie, so it really threw me when she started talking. Then I realised she was floating in water in the lake on Naboo. It's also pretty much how the book ends, so by bookending the story like that with the same imagery, it was a good choice and I thought it was clever. Captain Panaka's relationship with Padme seemed kind of forced. Apparently they used to confide in each other, then for some reason they grew distant. It seemed forced because none of this is ever shown in the movies and seemed to be included in the book just for the sake of having a dynamic to talk about. It didn't really feel like it was a natural fit for the book or the characters. I also didn't like the choices Johnston made with Panaka's career. We know from Leia, Princess of Alderaan, that he came into the favour of the Emperor, and it was he who fast-tracked Panaka to being governor of the Naboo sector. This seems out of place with Queen Shadow though, because Panaka retires, then at the end, with no explanation given whatsoever, he's appointed governor. It was just included for the sake of it, and it wouldn't have been a problem if Johnston had kept him in service until he was appointed as governor, but as it stands, it seems like he was pulled out of retirement or something, and that just didn't gel with me. It's not a direct contradiction of the lore, but it's not explained at all, so I didn't appreciate it. Speaking of contradictions to previously established lore, later on there's another thing that fucked me off, and yet again it's something that shouldn't have made it through Hidalgo's net. Padme points out that the Trade Federation owns the news company that's been writing lies about her and making her seem inept, and she says they've been slandering her. In a line straight out of Spider-Man, one of her handmaidens quickly points out that it's not slandering because it's print, and in print it's libel. After all these years of the new Disney canon telling us people can't read in the Star Wars universe, we're now supposed to believe they can? No, it's bullshit. They can't have it both ways. This is the same as the Emperor's face when he broadcasts to the galaxy. Sometimes he's young, sometimes he's old. It's an inconsistency that just isn't believable. It's yet another time Hidalgo hasn't done his job properly. He's the keeper of the Star Wars lore, and yet every book or comic I read seems to have something that contradicts previously established canon. I don't mind if an author makes a mistake and it's rectified before print, but yet again I ask, where are the proofreaders, and why didn't Hidalgo fix this before it went to print? It's his job, and there's continuity errors in literally every book and comic released. Seriously, I'm just so sick of this shit. If they can't be bothered to create a solid timeline with real continuity, why should I even be invested? And by extension, why should I pay for this shit? Why do these Disney fans keep lapping up these inconsistencies, then claiming Pablo Hidalgo and Fuckface Johnson are the best things to happen to the franchise? I really don't understand how these fucking morons think. Is it because there's a big push on women and LGBT characters? If it is, that's stupid, because including those characters in poorly written stories doesn't really do that community justice. There's a part of the story where some of Padme's handmaidens are trying to free the slaves on Tatooine because, as usual, people just had to force Anakin in there somewhere. It's almost as if Padme isn't interesting enough to have her own story, as I said at the beginning, and any story about her has to rely on other things to make the book seem interesting. So one of Padme's handmaidens goes to Tatooine, specifically to Shmi Skywalker's house, and finds it abandoned, but with a white sun carved above the door. This is never explained. It's brought up once, then never talked about again. They don't even bother to find out what it means, and I don't understand why. Didn't she bother to ask any of the other slaves what that meant? I mean, Shmi's house must be with the other slaves, so she could have asked literally anyone, and they would have told her what it meant. But they didn't, and it's fan service, not actual plot, and it's shit. This brings me to another problem. Queen Shadow is another book with fan service in the form of quotes from a movie, this time with Johnston saying a great many things quite a few times, obviously taken from Return of the Jedi, and there's another piece of fan service when Bria Organa says to Padme about how her children will handle the power of ruling over a planet, however that child comes to her. People don't fucking speak like that. And the only reason Johnston wrote it that way is because we the readers know Padme gives birth to Leia, who Bria then adopts. It's nice that she acknowledged that and tried to draw attention to it, but the way she did it was just stupid. Nobody talks like that, and for all the immersion it had, she may as well have just scribbled in the margins, "Look, it's Leia's stepmom and birth mum before she's born." Later on in the book we hear Padme say she can't imagine having twins. I mean, fuck me, come on Johnston, any other prophetic phrases you wanted Padme to say? How about something about being force choked by Anakin? The entire book relies on fan service and it's pathetic. You can't rely on that to drive an entire book, and Queen Shadow shows why. It's just boring as hell with references to everything but no actual plot of its own. This is an excellent example of why I don't like fan service. If the book was any good, she wouldn't need to include it. It would stand up on its own. Sadly, since nothing happens in the book, Johnston has been reduced to almost nothing but fan service to keep her book going for 300 pages, and it's pathetic. My understanding of the whole decoy thing was that people would target the decoy in case of an attack, and it also allowed Padme to walk around freely to hear things she wouldn't otherwise have heard in less intense situations. So imagine my disappointment when so much of the book leans on the whole decoy thing, only to have Padme stand on Captain Typho's shoulders and hang off a tree so she can eavesdrop on a conversation. I mean, what's the point of such an elegant design in subterfuge if she's only going to climb a tree to get the same information? Yet again, it's pathetic. The few attempts to create plot never go anywhere, they're inconsequential and are never built upon and lack any sense of excitement or depth. The Trade Federation attempts to kill Padme by luring her into a condemned building before it's destroyed. I've seen Scooby-Doo villains with more game, not to mention the fact that the whole situation lacked excitement. Bail Organa just walks out and says, "Go away, the building's condemned," and they do, they just fuck off somewhere else. Where's the sense of danger? Where's the sense of something being on the line? The entire book is just laughably bad. This scene represents a larger problem with the book. Johnston seems to have been so focused on writing about Padme and how peaceful she is that she completely eschews any action for her. There's literally none. This is a poor oversight in my opinion, because Padme does have another side to her that she brings out when she needs to. In fact, Johnston mentions this multiple times but doesn't include it as part of her character. Sporadically, she'll bring up how Padme had to step up as Queen of Naboo and do things that she didn't necessarily agree with, but did for the sake of her people, things that quite often put her in danger, as we saw in episode 1. These things may not necessarily be violent, but it's what some may think of as underhanded and ruthless. This can be lumped under the category of aggressive negotiations. So we know that side of her exists, and it's referenced in the book, so why couldn't we see any of that in the book? There's no reason to exclude that part of the character. What makes it worse is the fact that there was an ideal opportunity here for it to be included and Johnston just hasn't, because she wants to talk about Padme's hair and dresses. We see in Attack of the Clones how aggressively Newt Gunray wants Padme dead, so since his trial is still on, I see no reason why there couldn't have been a much deeper story here. We could have had Padme go into the building with her handmaidens. One of them spots the bomb, she calls out for everyone to run, but she doesn't get out. Then, while still finding her feet in the Senate, Padme could have investigated the death, and that could have taken her to a few planets, including Cato Nemoidia, gathered the evidence, and that final piece of evidence is what could have had Gunray imprisoned. And while all of this was happening, Padme could have been avoiding assassination attempts, since her testimony would have solidified Newt Gunray's guilty verdict. Do you see what I did there? I wrote a better story than Johnston off the top of my head, and that's a crying fucking shame. Instead of a decent plot like that, what we got was a book about hair, dresses, lesbians, and male shaming. What a fucking joke. And can we talk about Padme's name for a minute? I know Padme Nabiri, or whatever her fucking name is, isn't a new name. I'm sure I've heard it in Legends, but I personally haven't read a book or comic where it's explained why sometimes her last name is Amidala and why sometimes it's Nabarabari. So this book was the ideal opportunity for that to be explained in the new canon for people who don't know, but it never is. Johnston just switches between Nabarabari and Amidala as if having two different last names is the most normal thing in the world. There's a small mention about how people can change their names on Naboo, but it's not explained nearly enough for me and doesn't justify the fact that she has two last names. Then there's the fact that Padme talks about Amidala in the third person, which frustrated me no end. I get what Johnston was going for, trying to show that when Padme was queen she had to be Sasha Fierce, but fuck me, she's not Beyonce and it doesn't work. And then there's the way Padme treats Senator Rush Clovis. Yes, we know from the Clone Wars series that he's a bad guy. Not necessarily evil, perhaps just misguided from what I can recall, but the way Johnston has written Padme's attitude towards him is nothing short of male shaming. At one point he comes face to face with a planet's suffering and he has a funny look on his face because he's never witnessed this kind of suffering before, and internally Padme shames him, saying how it's disgusting that it took him this long to realise what it's like. Well, excuse me, princess, not everyone had the exact same life as Padme, whatever her last fucking name is, and Clovis's life just hasn't led him down that path. The fact is, when he came face to face with that kind of suffering, he stepped up, he helped out, he helped write a motion to pass in the Senate. If he'd have done nothing while knowing about the suffering, then yeah, Padme looking down her nose at him is something I can believe and think he deserves. But looking down her nose at someone who's actively trying to help her? No, that's not on, that's male shaming. Then there's the fact that he kisses her. Sure, she may not have reciprocated his feelings, that's fair. In fact, we know she doesn't from the Clone Wars show, but the fact remains that sometimes people can misread other people. Sometimes people take a gamble, especially when it comes to love. So when she responds with nothing more than, "How dare you, I didn't give you permission to think of our relationship that way," emphasis on think, my response is fuck you. I'm sorry, I didn't realise he needed her permission to think something. It's another example of the social justice warrior politics in this book. Between this and the fact that almost every male character that could be switched out for a female character was, the lesbians, the male shaming, it's clear this wasn't a book written for Star Wars fans. It's a book written to further the social justice warrior cause when it's completely unnecessary, and just like the Aftermath books, it does it at the expense of having a good Star Wars story. Fuck this shit. Just fuck it. When you take the dust jacket off, the same symbol that's used as a divider in the book is imprinted in a depression on the book's cover. I don't know what that symbol is, but it's there. Apart from that, there's nothing special about it, and that surprised me since the Ahsoka novel, also by Johnston, has the full cover art printed on the boards, just without the words, so it looked really good, and not having that on Queen Shadow was a bit disappointing. Speaking of the Ahsoka book, in hindsight I don't think it was that good. When I read it, I had only just started reading Star Wars books again after more than a decade, so I think the nostalgia was a part of why I enjoyed it, but looking back there wasn't really much going on with it. Sure, there was the lore about bleeding the crystals, which was cool, and it set up Ahsoka for her arc in Rebels nicely, but the actual story was very plain. So overall, Queen Shadow is just shit. It's really, really shit. It's laughably bad. It's another book in the new canon that makes no real sense. Nothing really happens and seems to exist purely to name drop other characters from the franchise. In this case, the emphasis was on the obvious characters from episode 1 and characters from the Clone Wars cartoon show, as well as serving to push women and the LGBT community to the forefront of the franchise. At the moment, we have the Women of the Galaxy book, but where's the Men of the Galaxy book? And don't get me started on the Star Wars Celebration panels, they were a fucking joke. These pictures are from Data Racer on Twitter, and just look at the diversity. Women and LGBT stuff. That's what they define as diversity. Where's the panel exclusively celebrating men or straight people? It's not equality when you favour one side over another. If they have gay dating, they should have straight dating. If they have celebrating women panel, they should have a celebrating men panel. It's called equality, and these people need to look it up in the fucking dictionary before they claim to stand for it. If you want a book that doesn't have a decent story, doesn't make sense, but does go into intricate detail about how Padme's hair is braided, this book is the book for you. If you want a decent Star Wars book, move along. Queen Shadow is incredibly shallow and does nothing even remotely engaging. Reading Queen Shadow is so boring, it's like watching paint dry, only worse. At least I don't have any expectations of excitement when watching paint dry. Make no mistake, this book is for girls and girls alone, and Johnston basically says as much in her afterword. In a word, it's shit.